Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a pretty intricate chapter of history. It's where Wall Street and the Russian Revolution kind of collide.
Ah, yes.
We're using Richard B. Spence's book as our main source, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905, 1925.
It's a good one.
Now, this isn't just going to be some dusty history lesson. We're going to really dig into the relationships between American capitalists and, well, the Russian revolutionaries in those years leading up to and then after the Bolsheviks took over. You might be surprised, actually, at just how much involvement there was in the motivations. Oh, they were complicated, to say the least.
One thing that Spence does really well is he challenges that, I guess you could say, that common narrative that the Russian Revolution was this one-off event. He presents it as this like 2-decade process and all these internal and external forces are kind of shaping it.
Yeah.
And of course, the American capitalists are right in the thick of it. Their interests and their actions kind of all intertwined with the revolutionary movement.
So let's paint a picture here. Russia in the early 1900s. Imagine a nation brimming with natural resources, populations booming, but there's widespread poverty and this deep discontent amongst the people. That contrast right there between the potential and the reality, well, it was a recipe for unrest.
And in that sort of pressure cooker, you've got all these different political factions all trying to grab power. The Tsarist autocracy, they're clinging on, but there's this huge pressure from liberals, socialists, revolutionaries. They've all got their own idea of what Russia should become. And that power struggle, it creates this vacuum, and that sucks in outside forces. That's where the American capitalists come in. They see opportunity, but of course, a lot of risk, too, and all that instability.
And now this is where it gets even more interesting. While all this is happening, the idea of, Americanism, it starts to take hold in Russia. People are looking at America's industrial power, their efficiency, the whole economic engine. Some Russians, they saw that as the path to modernization, the key to unlocking Russia's potential.
And that fascination with Americanization, it coincided with all these American businesses wanting a piece of that huge Russian market. Companies like International Harvester, Singer Sewing Machine, they smelled opportunity, so they start setting up shop in Russia.
Yeah.
It's this mix of economic interests and this yearning for a different way of doing things. And that set the stage for this really complex and contradictory relationship between, I'd say, American capitalism and the revolutionary forces that were bubbling up.
Okay, so we've got this volatile cocktail brewing. Social unrest, political instability, and you throw in the foreign economic interests. It's a recipe for, well, someone's got to give, right? Now let's meet some of the key players on the American side of things. First up, Charles R. Crane, a millionaire industrialist, but he's got this, I'd say, deep fascination with Russia. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines, though. Crane, he actively supported Russian liberals, revolutionaries, even funded individuals like Paul Milyukov, a major player in that liberal movement.
And Crane wasn't just focused on Russia. He had his fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. Involved with Sun Yat-sen's movement over in China, got mixed up in Balkan politics too. The guy was drawn to these global power plays. I mean, it's hard to separate sometimes, his philanthropy, his business deals, and those covert political actions.
Then you have Jacob-Schiff, head honcho at Kuhn Loeb Investment House. Schiff, he was very outspoken against Tsarist Russia. A lot of it stemmed from how Russia treated its Jewish citizens. But he didn't just talk. Schiff, he actively fought against any loans to Russia on Wall Street, driven by, I'd say, moral outrage, but also a pretty calculated move to weaken the Tsar.
Schiff's whole stance against the Tsarist regime, it makes you think. How much was he using his money to push his political agenda? Was he a humanitarian, first and foremost? Or was he maybe looking to weaken a rival and, boost his own business interests at the same time? It's a tough one to answer definitively.
And of course, then there's the king of Wall Street himself, J.P. Morgan. Unlike Crane and Schiff, who seemed driven by a blend of, ideals and opportunism, Morgan was cautious about Russia. He was a pragmatist, always thinking about the bottom line.
You can see right there how different these American financial giants were in how they viewed Russia. Some, like Crane, they were driven by this vision of Russia's future, very romantic. Others, like Morgan, they were all about calculating the risks and maximizing the profits. Two very different approaches.
All right, let's shift back to Russia for a minute. 1905 was a huge turning point in their history. Bloody Sunday, that's what they called it. Tsarist troops opened fire on peaceful protesters. That sparked massive unrest and a surge in revolutionary activity. It was a moment, I think, that shattered any illusion of a, benevolent Tsar.
Bloody Sunday, it sent shockwaves both inside Russia and around the world. Within Russia, you had strikes, protests, mutinies. The Tsar's grip on power, it was seriously shaken. And internationally, there was widespread condemnation. Especially in the U.S., news of that massacre, it really drummed up support for the Russian people, for their fight for freedom. The American media, they played a huge role in shaping public opinion, painting this picture of good versus evil, tyranny against freedom.
And we can't forget the influence of the Russian Jewish emigres in America during this time. They were actively supporting the revolution from afar, raising funds, spreading information, leveraging their connections, to try and sway public opinion, even influence government policy.
The Russian Jewish community here in America, they became this powerful voice for change back in Russia. Their efforts, and you combine that with the outrage over Bloody Sunday, well, it created this climate of support for the revolutionaries. It had a lasting impact, that's for sure.
Now, the 1905 revolution, it also saw all these different revolutionary factions inside Russia, all competing for power. Among them were the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. They had this radical Marxist ideology, and their goal was to seize power using a very disciplined party. Their rise, I'd say, it changed the game, brought a whole new level of ideological passion and strategic thinking to that fight against the Tsar.
The Bolsheviks, they were a minority group then, but man, were they good at exploiting that growing unrest, the Tsar's weaknesses, the failures of the liberals. They offered this radical solution: overthrow everything, build a socialist state. And that message, it resonated with people who were increasingly disillusioned with the way things were. It was the foundation for their eventual rise to power. Then, of course, World War I breaks out. Europe descends into this chaos, and American capital, well, it gets even more entangled in Russia. It was partly driven by, the financial demands of wartime, but also, I think, that allure of those juicy opportunities. The Tsar, he needed money desperately to keep the war effort going, and American financiers, they saw a chance not just to profit, but to maybe possibly nudge things in Russia in a direction they liked.
A central figure in all this financial maneuvering was a guy named Olaf Ashmark. He was Swedish, a financier, but with connections on Wall Street. And, get this, in those Russian revolutionary circles too. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Ashberg, he's the one who brokers loans from American institutions like Guarantee Trust, National City Bank to, of all people, the Tsarist government.
Ashberg, he's a bit of a paradox. He's funneling American dollars to a regime he personally opposes. It shows you just how much those cold, hard calculations drove financial decisions back then. I mean, here's this guy, profit trumps ideology, even when you've got this global conflict raging with all its ideological baggage.
And then you've got the American Red Cross mission to Russia. Now, this wasn't just about bandages and soup kitchens. Key figures within that mission, particularly William Boyce Thompson and Raymond Robbins, they got pulled right into the heart of that political maelstrom. Their agendas, their loyalties, they got all tangled up with the fate of the whole Russian Revolution.
That American Red Cross mission, it's a window into just how complicated American involvement was in all this. It was like a microcosm of those conflicting motives. You've got Thompson, this wealthy businessman. He's initially very wary of the Bolsheviks. Then you have Robbins. He's a social reformer, and he actually gets pretty close to Leon Trotsky, ends up a big supporter of the Bolshevik cause.
It's amazing, isn't it? These guys, they go over there with humanitarian aid in mind, and they get swept up in revolutionary politics. Their actions, a lot of times they were doing their own thing, sometimes going against official U.S. policy.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you sometimes it's those personal convictions, those relationships that can really steer events.
And on top of all that, you have these parallel intelligence operations run by private individuals, but they've got close ties to the bigwigs in government and business. Driven by, I'd say, a mix of patriotism, personal ambition, this desire to kind of, mold events to fit their vision. They were operating outside the normal diplomatic channels, gathering information, cultivating those relationships, sometimes getting involved in covert actions. A lot of it, even today, remains shrouded in secrecy.
Charles Crane, remember him? The supporter of Russian liberals. Well, during the war, he gets involved in some pretty shady stuff. He starts working with a guy named Xenophon Calamachiano. He was a Greek-American businessman, had connections in both the American and Russian governments. They were gathering intel, trying to influence what was going on in Russia.
Crane's involvement in those backroom operations, it just goes to show you the official diplomacy. That was only part of the story. Behind the scenes, you've got this network of individuals. They've got their own agendas, their own connections, and they're actively trying to shape things, operating in the shadows, leaving behind a lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to a guy who becomes absolutely central to the Bolshevik Revolution, Leon Trotsky. He spends a short but really important time in New York City in early 1917. And that period, It gives you a glimpse into those connections between Russian revolutionaries and, you guessed it, American financiers. Really key to understanding Trotsky's rise to power and everything that unfolds in Russia.
Trotsky lands in New York in January 1917, pivotal moment. He steps into this city that's just teeming with Russian exiles, radical sympathizers, and those who, well, let's just say they saw opportunity in all the chaos across the Atlantic. And what he does during that time, who he meets, it's been the subject of so much speculation and debate, especially the question of, how did he fund all this and who was backing him?
That whole mystery around Trotsky's funding, it's fueled all sorts of theories. Some say it was Jacob-Schiff, remember him, big opponent of the Tsar. Others say no, it was a more complex network, a mix of ideological supporters, maybe some investors looking to make a quick buck, those who just wanted to exploit the whole situation.
The fact that there's no smoking gun when it comes to Trotsky's funding, it tells you how secretive all this was. It's a world of whispers, hidden motives, where ideology and business and personal ambitions, they all get blurred together. What we can say, from what we know, is that Trotsky wasn't some lone wolf. He was part of this network of people and groups, both in Russia and internationally, who wanted that revolution, and they were willing to put their money where their mouth was.
And then, to make things even more interesting, you've got this Sverdlov connection. We're talking about Trotsky's relatives, Benjamin Sverdlov and Abram Zvitovsky. Their business dealings, very hush-hush. They hint at this possible link between, financial interest and those revolutionary goals. Makes you wonder, did those family ties, did those personal connections grease the wheels for funds flowing to the revolutionary movement?
The Sverdlov brothers, they were operating in both worlds, the business world and the world of revolution. Their ties to both Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, it raises some eyebrows, that's for sure. Were they true believers, or did they see a chance to cash in on the upheaval in Russia? It's a question that still intrigues historians and keeps that speculation alive about, the hidden hand of American finance in shaping the Russian Revolution. One guy who really embodies that pursuit of profit in the midst of all that chaos was Washington Vanderlip. Ambitious businessman, had connections to some pretty powerful people in the Harding administration. Vanderlip, she had this vision, saw this huge economic potential in Russia's Far East. He wanted to get his hands on this massive concession in Kamchatka. We're talking fishing rights, mining operations, even developing the infrastructure there.
Vanderlip, he never quite pulled it off. But his story, it's a fascinating look into the minds of those American businessmen who saw, a gold rush in post-revolutionary Russia.
Okay.
I mean, here he is negotiating with the Bolsheviks, these guys who were, let's be honest, anti-capitalist to the core and known for being ruthless. But the allure of profit, that belief that American know-how could win out, even in the toughest situations, that was powerful.
Vanderlip's story also shows you just how complicated and how unpredictable dealing with the Soviet regime could be. At first, he's making progress, gets this preliminary agreement for that Kamchatka concession, but then things shift. The Soviet leadership changes, you've got bureaucratic roadblocks, and this growing distrust of foreigners. It all comes crashing down.
It's a cautionary tale, really. Shows you how tricky and sometimes how downright illusory chasing profit in that kind of system can be. You've got centralized control, ideological rigidity, and this deep suspicion of anyone who's a capitalist. Even the best-connected, most resourceful guys, they could get caught out by those sudden shifts in Soviet politics. It was a risky business, that's for sure.
Now, in contrast to Vanderlip's big swing, which didn't quite connect, you've got the American Relief Administration, the ARA, headed up by, of all people, Herbert Hoover before he became president. This is a great example of how humanitarian aid, it could actually bridge the gap between two worlds that were ideologically opposed. The ARA, they were driven by compassion, but also some strategic thinking. They launched this huge effort to fight the famine that was ravaging Russia in the early 20s. The Bolsheviks, they were suspicious at first, but in the end, the ARA delivered tons of food, medical supplies, saved millions of lives.
The ARA, what they did in Russia, it proved that America and Soviet Russia could cooperate, even with that huge ideological divide. Hoover, he was a pragmatist. He wanted to help the Russian people, but he also had American interests in mind. And it worked. They eased the suffering, and they laid the groundwork for, I'd say, a better relationship between the two countries down the line.
The fact that the ARA could work with the Soviets, even with all the obstacles and the mistrust, it shows you the power of pragmatism. Sometimes even when you've got this clash of ideologies, if you've got a shared humanitarian goal, that can cut through the politics and create some common ground.
Now, as we move into the mid-1920s, things change. The initial chaos of the revolution, it settles down, and you've got Joseph Stalin consolidating power. This is a guy who's ambition, his dedication to communist ideology, well, it would reshape the Soviet Union and have a huge impact on global politics for decades to come.
Lenin dies in 24, and that's the end of an era. It triggers this power struggle among the Bolshevik leadership. Stalin, he was a master at playing the game, ruthless in his climb to the top. He outmaneuvers everyone, Trotsky included, and becomes the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. His rise, it had huge implications for the Soviet people and for the world. It ushered in an era of repression, forced collectivization, and this drive to industrialize at breakneck speed.
But even as the Soviet regime becomes more and more authoritarian, and that gap between America and Soviet Russia widens, American businesses, they're still drawn to that Soviet potential. All those resources, the potential market for American goods, and that idea that maybe, just maybe, economic ties could give them some leverage, some influence, it was enough to keep some American companies trying to find ways to get in on the action.
One story that illustrates that pull of the Soviet market is the International Barnstall Corporation. Run by a guy named Henry Mason Day, seasoned businessman, knew people on Wall Street and in the oil industry. Day, he sees that the Soviets want to industrialize, and he smells opportunity. He wants a concession to develop the Baku oil fields. If he pulls it off, it's a potential gold mine.
Day's story is a lesson in just how tough and how complicated doing business with the Soviets was in those days. All those negotiations, bureaucratic hurdles, political maneuvering. At first it looks promising, but it falls apart. The Soviets, they're stubborn, their economic priorities change, and then you've got those growing political tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
International Barnstall, their venture into the Soviet oil industry, it shows you the challenges, the disappointments of dealing with a regime that was inherently suspicious of foreign capitalists, and ultimately was going to do things their way according to their ideology. Even the most well-meaning, well-planned business deals, they could get steamrolled by those unpredictable shifts in Soviet politics. It was a high-risk, high-reward game, and not everyone walked away a winner.
And as Stalin tightens his grip, anyone who disagrees, well, they disappear. Trotsky and his followers, they're pushed aside, persecuted, eliminated. Stalin wanted total control.
And you see that ruthlessness in the deaths of some key figures in Trotsky's circle, Abram Zivotofsky in 25 and then Ephraim Sklansky later that same year. Makes you wonder, what were those power struggles really like? How far was Stalin willing to go to silence his opponents?
Those deaths, they happen as Stalin's power is peaking and Trotsky's influence is fading. It creates this really unsettling atmosphere. Anyone who challenged Stalin, well, they were walking on thin ice. Yeah. And Sklansky's death, it's particularly strange. He goes to America, then there's this fatal boating accident on Long Lake. A lot of unanswered questions there.
You've got people with ties to both the Soviets and American intelligence, and they're all in that same area when Sklansky dies. It adds a whole other layer of mystery. Were American intelligence agencies keeping tabs on the Soviets here? Did they play a role in what happened to Sklansky? It's hard to say.
You put it all together, Soviet officials, American intelligence, people connected to both sides, all in the middle of nowhere in the Adirondacks. It's a recipe for intrigue. It speaks to this hidden world of espionage, covert ops, all happening under the surface of official diplomacy. A world where loyalties could shift, motives were murky, and the truth was hard to find.
So we've come to the end of our deep dive into Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. And what we're left with is this feeling of, wow, this was a complicated time. It's not a black and white story. It forces us to think about those gray areas, the contradictions in human nature. The past, it's rarely as neat and tidy as we might like it to be.
The story of Wall Street in Russia during those revolutionary years, it's a mix of ideology, ambition, opportunism, tragedy. It's a story that reminds us of the power dynamics, the allure of money, that constant struggle between, I'd say, idealism and pragmatism, both on an individual level and on a national scale.
The people we've talked about, Crane, Schiff, Thompson, Hoover, they all had different motives, different ways of approaching those events in Russia. Their stories, sometimes they intertwine, sometimes they clash, but they give us this nuanced view of a really crucial period in history. And they show just how difficult it was to understand and to respond to a revolution that shook the world order and changed the geopolitical landscape for generations.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. We hope this deep dive has shed some light on this complex and really consequential chapter of history.